Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, I will have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled.
President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin meeting on American soil for a high-stakes summit.
It will take me no longer than one day.
President Trump initially said he wanted a ceasefire agreement, but then shifted his position, saying he was hoping for a broader peace deal instead.
When I win, I will immediately bring prices down starting on day one.
After much anticipation and intrigue, President Trump has finally unveiled his plan for sweeping reciprocal tariffs. Some economists warn it could ultimately lead to higher prices and inflation.
President Trump traveling to Turkey later today for the annual NATO summit, a gathering of leaders from the alliance. The president, of course, has long criticized.
We don't need anybody's help. I didn't even want their help. I don't have wars. I had no wars.
We are following breaking news this morning. Overnight, the United States has carried out what President Trump calls, quote, a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured.
Breaking news overnight and developing this morning. The U.S. and Israel launching major combat operations against Iran.
Mr. President, there are no signs that Iran is ready to stop fighting. So what is the plan? Is the plan to just keep bombing until they give up?
There are no signs. Why, do you know something that I don't know?
You know, it's always been a traditional notion in Washington that a president's second term in office usually focuses more on foreign policy in an attempt to solidify a global legacy. That's also true for President Trump. Despite his America First agenda, the war in Ukraine, global tariffs, battle with NATO allies, regime change in Venezuela, and the ongoing war in Iran, they've all dominated the Trump administration's focus since he returned to office last year. Let's talk about it with President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. And Richard, this keeps going, and I think we need to put some perspective on it for our friends that are watching every day, because things come at us so quickly. Let's step back and just say, here's an America First president who said, I'm not going to get you into any more wars. We're going to focus on home instead of away. And look what's happened. He started by threatening Greenland, threatening Canada, threatening Cuba, invading Venezuela, invading Iran, insulting NATO, insulting Meloni in Italy, insulting the Prime Minister of Spain, and insulting seemingly every other good ally that we have. You know, yanking troops out of Germany, threatening to take troops out of Poland, one of our best military allies. I know it's asking a lot, but tell us where we are as almost 2 years in to Trump's second term globally, and how would you define his foreign policy?
Joe, if I had to come up with a phrase, I would call it a kind of aggressive unilateralism. And I think that's the overriding characteristic of it. There's obviously an anti-allied, anti-European bias. As you know, when Donald Trump came into office, he really believed two things passionately. One was a real animus against allies, and second of all, a real animus against trade, that somehow trade was ripping up off. So I think some of that was predictable for Donald Trump. Some of the excesses, the thing you mentioned, Greenland, Canada, that's an odd thing. And I didn't see that coming. Traditionally, the United States, Joe, has run what I would call an imperial foreign policy. We were promoting a kind of order. This is more of an imperialist foreign policy. He's looking at things to acquire, whether it's access to energy in Venezuela or new pieces of real estate in Greenland or Canada. I think all of that. And then I'd put in a separate box, Joe, because it's hard to find a common thread, Iran. And the only way I can make sense of Iran, and I don't think you'll disagree with this, is that he got it dead wrong. Iran was going to be an easy cakewalk, another Venezuela. If you look at the national security strategy, you look at everything Donald Trump promised, it wasn't to get into open-ended, costly wars. So there's no way to make sense of Iran except that the president and those around him totally got it wrong. And now he's caught and he's flailing because he's not sure whether to double down or to back out. And that's where I think we are. But the most common characteristic, again, is one of unilateralism.
Aggressive unilateralism, which, again, doesn't really have too many parallels that you can connect Donald Trump with other presidents in the past. I will say so much of this has to do with legacy. If you're talking about seizing Greenland, even if it offends all of our NATO allies, calling Canada the 51st state, even though they're one of our closest, most important allies. This aggressive unilateralism and insulting of allies has put us in a very difficult position. I want to add to the discussion contributing editor at the Financial Times, Kim Ghattas. And Kim, Richard was just talking about how both the United States and Israel find itself greatly challenged. The United States tied down in Iran, and Israel not only tied down across the region, but also more unpopular with United States voters than at any time since 1948. How is that impacting the direction not only of this war, but also the region?
Joe, it's very interesting to hear Richard speak about Israeli overreach and American overreach, because I also think the Iranians are overreaching at this moment in the conflict. And reading through the tea leaves of what Iranian officials are saying, including the foreign minister, Araghchi, who was speaking just over the weekend in an interview, there's really a sense that although it may look like they have the upper hand, closing the Strait of Hormuz, inflicting damage and casualties on the United States and its forces and troops in the region, they also feel quite stuck. It sounds like from listening to these interviews, the Iranian foreign minister was sounding quite demoralized almost. So how this is translating in the region is differently in each country. In Lebanon, there's a real sense that we are stuck between the Israeli fire and Iranian fire. The Iranians using Lebanon as a battleground to fight their wars against America and Israel, and the Israelis, of course, establishing this depopulated, uninhabitable buffer zone in southern Lebanon. We have the Lebanese president in the United States meeting President Trump, and we'll have to see what that what that leads to in terms of any concessions that the United States can get from Israel for the Lebanese. And then across the Gulf, Joe, you have a sense of limbo. Of course, Arab countries, Gulf countries were not happy to be dragged into this war that they didn't ask for, that they cautioned against. But there's also a lot of anger at Iran. And I would not discount that as a factor in how things unfold going forward.
Boy, that's so important. Let's bring in a columnist and associate editor at the Washington Post, David Ignatius. David, let's underline Kim's point right now, because obviously we're looking at this from a position of how this is could be a growing quagmire for the United States. If you step back and just look over the past year or two, you have an Iranian regime, which you said was ready to fall under its own weight. The fact that Donald Trump may have given them a second life doesn't take away from the fact they still face the same economic challenges. They still face the same popular discontent there. But it is fascinating when Kim talks about the Iranian foreign minister being down over the weekend. It reminds me, again, as we talked about earlier this week, David, of the checks and balances in the United States. He might as well be the Senate Majority Leader who can't get a bill through because, as we've said time and again, between the Revolutionary Guard and the mullahs and the parliament and the president and the president's cabinet, there are a lot of checks and balances there in Iran. There always have been. They've just been made more scrambled and Byzantine since this war began. Talk us through that.
So we've been talking about how the United States is stuck, and I think that's equally true of Iran. Iran has been hit so hard, and that comes after years of economic neglect and decline. Let's not forget the Iranian people were so unhappy. In January, they were in the streets by the tens of thousands, risking their lives to protest this regime. The estimates at that time were maybe 20% at most supported the regime. The rest of the country was really ready for change. And I suspect that remains true. The problem is that the people who have the guns in Iran are just intoxicated with their resistance to the United States and Israel. And you can understand why. They've stood up to bombardment. They're still going. They're still fighting. So they think this conflict is going their way. It's going their way only in the sense that they're still in the game. They're still able to fire drones and missiles to hit targets in Bahrain and Jordan, inflict casualties, deaths on the United States. So that gives them a sense of power. But they're really playing a pretty weak hand. Week by week, their ability to project power declines. My own feeling is that the biggest mistake that President Trump could make is to deepen American involvement on the ground. I suspect that's precisely the thing that the Iranians would like to see us do. I'm reminded of bin Laden's strategy after 9/11 to suck the United States into a conflict, protracted conflict on their turf. So I think there's a lot of that going on with Iran. In a month, if the U.S. is successful in choking their revenues, they're going to be in even worse shape, and they're going to have a population that says, hey, wait a minute, how are we going to beat the United States? And so I think Trump has to do the thing that's obviously hardest for him, which is to be patient, to rely on, overwhelming U.S. economic and military power. And I'd add one more thing, Joe. Part of what really has troubled me about this war is that the United States has been acting alone, other than Israel, in combating Iran. That shouldn't be. Iran is a menace to the region. We've gotten some help from our Gulf allies, but not much. I think the time really has come to reach out to Europe and to Asia and ask people, whatever you're prepared to do, and there'll be limits on that, to help the United States reopen the Strait of Hormuz. We'd like your help. Request it, seek it, because I think to the extent this is an international campaign to reopen the strait, and we'll leave aside for the moment the question of Iran's political future, we'll be in better shape.
All right, let's hold right there, and we'll be back with more of this fascinating conversation with Richard Haass, David Ignatius, and Kim Ghattas on Morning Joe. And we're back talking to Richard Haass, David Ignatius, and Kim Ghattas on where America is right now in Iran and the region.
Kim, I have a question for you. We're about 100 days, plus or minus, away from the Israeli election. What is your sense of how that affects what Israel is prepared to do? How does it, in both directions, how does this debate that we're having here, you, David, and I, how is that playing out in Israel? Does this help or hurt the chances of Bibi Netanyahu in October? And more broadly, what do you think Israel wants to happen, this government wants to happen in the run-up to the election? What do they think will help their prospects?
Well, I think that Benjamin Netanyahu would like to have some kind of big, spectacular success. Why he thinks that is still possible after the previous military campaigns did not deliver is unclear. And for him, success means the fall of the regime, not change of leadership, because we've heard from President Trump saying, "Oh, we've had new leadership, we've had regime change." The Islamic Republic is still very much there, and of course we've heard all the stories about the Israelis reaching out to former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to be the next leader. I mean, I think there are a lot of details that are still unclear about that and how they foresaw that he could play into the future of Iran. But I do think that for Benjamin Netanyahu, some kind of big success is going to be essential for him going into this election campaign. He's not doing well in the polls, and I don't see him fading into the sunset and, accepting that he has failed to deliver long-term security and peace for the Israelis. Now, we can have an argument about the fact that his approach to delivering peace and security to the Israelis is misguided because, as you were saying, Richard, Israel is now fighting wars on at least 7 fronts. Benjamin Netanyahu boasts about it, but there isn't a pure military victory at the end of this that is going to ensure Israel's long-term security and peace in the region. This is not World War II, which is what the Israelis often, or this government often refers to as an example.
Kim, if I could jump in on one thing. You're Lebanese. You understand Lebanon better than anybody I know writing these days. If you were sitting down with President Aoun at this moment, where he has amazingly a sort of peace agreement with Israel, agreement
a framework agreement, to be specific.
What would you ask President Aoun about what's ahead? And what do you think is the real pathway? Is there a real chance here for Lebanon finally to reestablish its sovereignty with a strong general, now the president of the country, something that I have dreamed of since I first went to Lebanon more than 45 years ago? I've watched this country, surrender its sovereignty, be beaten up by everybody in the neighborhood, including Israel. Is there a moment now, finally, for your country to come back and have its own, firm hand on its security?
That's certainly what a lot of Lebanese hope for, David. And to answer your question, I want to add something to my answer to Richard, which is that what happens next also depends on what happens with the Israeli elections. Between now and the Israeli elections, we're not going to see any real concessions by Benjamin Netanyahu to Lebanon. They're not really going to withdraw their troops. They're not going to have large redeployments, even though they are coming under pressure from the Trump administration to do so, and to give something to the Lebanese that President Aoun can then show to his citizens to say, this is what I can get you through negotiations, as opposed to the destructions that war between Hezbollah and Israel has gotten us. And then when we have these Israeli elections, the alternatives, whether it's Gadi Eisenkot from the military or Naftali Bennett, who's also on the right, aren't really campaigning in a much more malleable with a much more malleable position towards Lebanon. Quite the contrary, they're campaigning to the right of Netanyahu on Lebanon and other issues, and saying he should have continued a very forceful war against Lebanon and not caved to Donald Trump. So a lot now rests in the hands of Marco Rubio and Donald Trump as to what they can help the Israelis and the Lebanese achieve at this crucial moment, 2 months before the Israeli elections. When it comes to Hezbollah's role in Lebanon, I would venture to say that there's a large majority of Lebanese, I would go as far as 70% of the population, that is opposed to Hezbollah continuing to carry weapons. They want a strong state. There is a lot of support for this president, for this prime minister, but that doesn't mean that they support Israeli bombing campaigns against their country. The devastation in South Lebanon is not getting enough attention, but it is really painful to watch whole villages being decimated and flattened by Israeli troops. The Lebanese authorities, on the other hand, also need to be more assertive. They're not going to go in and forcibly disarm Hezbollah because that could lead to civil strife, but they can neutralize this party by legal means, financial means, interdicting flow of weapons, flow of money, and delivering certain concessions and show that diplomacy can deliver for Lebanon. In the meantime, the Lebanese authorities, with the help of the Trump administration, need to do as much as they can to crowd out the party and assert Lebanese sovereignty as the only alternative for a prosperous future for Lebanon.
Richard, listening to you all speak and this extraordinary conversation you're having between each other, I'm just reminded so often of how the United States through history has gotten itself in trouble with overreach. And we've talked about overreach in Iran, the warnings that David Ignatius and you and everyone else gave President Trump that Iran was not Venezuela. And the overreach of Netanyahu and the idea that somehow we can destroy Hamas and destroy Hezbollah by leveling Gaza and South Lebanon. That has blown up in their face. It's made them less secure. It's made them less popular in the United States. What is Israel's way out of this? What is the United States' way out of this?
Just to say, Joe, when you look at the sweep of history, just very quickly as an aside, overreach turns out to be the biggest flaw of American foreign policy. We overreached in Korea when we marched north of the 38th parallel and tried to reunify the country. Vietnam was a case of overreach, obviously Iraq, and now Iran. And these are the greatest tragedies of post-World War II foreign policy. There's also cases of underreach, I get it, but I actually think overreach has been the bigger problem. Going forward, I think in Iran, what we have to do is stop escalating and stop thinking that by forcing this conflict, that we can either get regime change or capitulation or an acceptable outcome. I actually say we ought to find a way to reach an accommodation on the Strait. I think almost going back to what you and I have been talking about for months, since I proposed the blockade, but open for all or closed to all. We ought to be prepared to drop our blockade for Iran to stop attacks on shipping. I also think we've got to do two other things big time. One is we have got to provide defense for our friends. These attacks on Kuwait, on the UAE, and others against their water infrastructure, against their energy infrastructure. This is a disaster. So the United States has got to, maybe working with Ukraine and others, accelerate the introduction of defenses. And we've also got to marginalize or at least reduce the salience of the Strait of Hormuz. And this means accelerating new ports, new pipelines, new areas of energy production to make it a less significant waterway and therefore less valuable to Iran. We've got to keep the economic pressure on Iran. I'd actually scrap the MOU. But it takes two here. And I think one of the interesting questions, going back to our larger conversation, is whether Iran understands the lesson of Ayatollah Khomeini. Towards the end of the Iran-Iraq war, he was willing to compromise because he knew he had to, even though he described it as drinking poison. But he believed he needed to compromise in order to save the revolution. So I think one of the interesting questions is if the United States is wise enough to pull back from its overreach and pull back from its illusions that there's somehow a military answer here, is whether you have an Iranian leader or leadership that also is willing to pull back somewhat and understand that if they're going to tend to their economy and preserve their revolution, they've gone about as far as they can go militarily here. So I think actually both sides have to deal with their overreach, or all three sides, including Israel.
All right, Richard Haass, The Washington Post, David Ignatius, and Kim Ghattas of the Financial Times. We thank all of you for being with us. Greatly appreciate it. And we'll be right back with more Morning Joe.
I know that this administration is working around the clock to resolve that in a way so that we don't suffer any more troop losses. This is a great tragedy. It shouldn't happen. But it is a very important objective that I believe we've achieved to ensure that the largest sponsor of state of terrorism does not have a nuclear weapon. That would be a disaster for everybody, and everybody around the world understands that. Now we got to wrap it up.
Welcome back to Morning Joe. That was House Speaker Mike Johnson yesterday urging the White House to wrap up the war in Iran. Let's now bring in MS Now senior Capitol Hill reporter and host of Way Too Early, Ali Vitale. Ali, thanks for coming back on. We just had listened to a really great conversation, Joe and the gang there, talking about Iran and the dilemma the United States and Israel finds itself in there with the region. I have a new piece out in The Atlantic late last night suggesting that President Trump is back at war. He just doesn't want to admit it. And it also just he's how boxed in he is, and how we're hearing some on the right urging him, you got to, quote, finish the job, however whatever that means, and really, whether it's an increased air power or maybe even a ground invasion to try to loosen Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz, or we're starting to hear this more and more on Fox News, those who suggest, maybe it's time just to cut our losses, to get out of there altogether, live with the consequences, but hope that some sort of deal can be struck to lower prices ahead of the midterms to try to salvage any Republican chances. Certainly, this is a debate they're having on the Hill as well.
It's the debate they're having on the Hill as well. And the fact that you're now hearing the House Speaker come forward and say some version of those two dual poles, right? The idea that they don't want to see Iran be a quagmire in perpetuity, but at the same time, they also don't want it to be the closing message of the 2026 midterms. I think Johnson's saying both of those things, that they want to derail Iran's nuclear program and ambitions, but then also wrap it up, is exactly the conversation that Capitol Hill Republicans are having, because they are aware of the polling, of the prices at the pump, and the fact that that makes the politics of this midterm election, which was already going to be difficult for them, given what history tells us about the first midterm for a ruling party in power, they now have an even steeper hill to climb. And the fact that Pete Hegseth was once again yesterday back on Capitol Hill with a ballooning total figure for the cost of the Iran war, and lawmakers asking what is a valid question of, you're coming here asking for this supplemental funding, how many more times are you going to have to come up here as this war continues to stretch into its 6th month with no clear end in sight because negotiations are off the rails? And I think that is one of the key questions that lawmakers would be asking anyway, but certainly the closer November gets, the louder those calls are going to be.
And it is about growing costs. It's a cost in terms of how much money is being spent, how many munitions are being used, the costs back at home as we see gas prices go over $4 a gallon earlier this week. And, of course, most importantly, the cost in American lives. There have been several service members killed in the Middle East in recent days. And Allie, I mean, it's so rare for House Speaker Johnson to ever dare defy the president. Even this, like a subtle urge, feels like a lot from him, considering how beholden he is to the West Wing. But do we think there'll be more of this, especially for those who are facing tough re-election battles in the House, but also in the upper chamber? There are certainly some Iran hawks in the Republican caucus there, although obviously one less now with Lindsey Graham's sudden passing. But there are also those who are going to look at their re-election fights and go, this is going to be hard. It's going to be harder if we're still bombing Iran. We're now 11 days in a row and counting.
The roads are going to begin to diverge. At what point is sort of the open question that we've been asking. Primary season winding down, mostly done. Members are going to be able to start turning to their re-election fights, looking at their internal polls, and recognizing the points where they might have to disagree with this White House in order to try to save their own political fortunes. Certainly, there are several swing districts where I can imagine that to be true and where I'm going to be looking closely to see if the tides are turning. But at the same time, and you know this well, Lamir, for Republicans, hawkishness on Iran is sort of baked in the ideological cake. And so they do like the fact that President Trump was willing to take an aggressive posture toward Iran broadly. It's the impacts of that on the domestic front that are making the politics of this difficult at a time when poll after poll shows that voters want a focus on affordability and domestic issues, everything from groceries to health care. And that doesn't seem like where the White House's focus is, not just because of Iran, but because think of the way they started the year on Venezuela, then moving to Iran, open questions still about Cuba. It's an administration that wants to build its legacy on the world stage at a time when domestic issues are what voters say they want them to focus on.
And, of course, so often these midterms, the most decisive issue, the economy. Let's address that now. President Trump vowed to improve the nation's economy when he took office for the second time. But now, 18 months later, Americans continue to say they are not seeing the benefits. Former Treasury official and Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Rattner joins us now with charts. Yes, you see them. The charts are here, and he'll be fact-checking the promises that Trump has made about the economy, starting with the national debt. Good morning, Steve. Take it away.
Good morning, Jonathan. Yeah, you could call this segment Promises Made, Promises Not Kept. And there are many to talk about on the economy, things like inflation. He promised to get gas prices down to $2 and so forth. But I want to talk about just a couple of those today and really start with the budget deficit and the national debt. So Trump, of course, promised that he would cut the deficit sharply during his term. That actually hasn't happened. If you look at the deficit, actually, we can go back all the way to Obama. He left the country with less than $1 trillion deficit. That sounds almost a little bit quaint today. We obviously had COVID. But here's Trump. And so he came in and the budget deficit was $1.8 trillion the year before he arrived. Now it's $1.9 trillion. It's going to stay at $1.9 trillion. And the Congressional Budget Office projects it will go up to $2.5 trillion. How did this happen? Why did this happen? A lot of it is the one big beautiful bill. You'll remember the tax cuts that Trump put in place, which he said were going to juice the economy and get growth going, and that they would, in effect, pay for themselves. None of that has really happened. You can see that in the national debt. When you start to add these numbers to our debt, obviously the debt goes up. We just crossed 100% national debt relative to the size of the economy. That's a psychological figure, but nonetheless something people pay attention to. We are on track to hit 106% of debt to GDP, which would actually surpass the World War II record. And that is going to come actually 2 years sooner than we thought it was going to come, because the Trump deficits actually are going up instead of down. And then by 2036, it could reach 120% of GDP.
So, Steve, your second chart analyzes the savings promised through the now defunct Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, as well as sweeping tariffs. So let's take a look now at some of the claims made by DOGE head Elon Musk and President Trump.
But we set up DOGE.
Yes.
How much do you think we can rip out of this wasted $6.5 trillion Harris-Biden budget?
Well, I think we can do at least $2 trillion.
Yeah!
Yes.
$2 trillion.
I mean, at the end of the day, you're being taxed. You're being taxed. All government spending is taxation. So whether it's direct taxation or all government spending, it either becomes inflation or it's direct taxation. Your money is being wasted, and the Department of Government Efficiency is going to fix that.
As you know, we're taking in trillions of dollars from tariffs, and they've been so incredible for our country, so incredible. We're keeping our companies happy. We're keeping them solid and sane. And they're very, very thrilled at what's happened. They can't even believe it. And we've never seen investment like this. Without the tariffs, we would have just a fraction of that. And we're really the only one that can do tariffs. Nobody else is able to do them.
So, Steve, were they right about any of that?
Well, they were right in their goals, but not right in the execution. It's actually pretty funny to listen to it. So, yeah, part of, again, what I said before of how they were going to deal with the deficit was cut taxes, but also cut spending. And you heard Elon Musk talk about $2 trillion they were going to cut over some unspecified period of time. By their own claims, the stuff they have put out, they claim a number of $215 billion. However, they put up what was called a wall of receipts. They put up sort of a list of all the cuts that they had thought they had achieved. And when you actually add them up, it comes to $35 billion, plus or minus. And a bunch of private experts have tried to look at this number as well, gotten to the same place. So they didn't really cut spending at all in any material way. And, of course, other kinds of spending continue to go up. I love the fact that Trump was talking about trillions of dollars of tariff revenue. You'll see at the peak month, it only hit $32 billion. And so this would have to go on for many, many, many months. I can't even calculate the number in my head to get to trillions of dollars. But then the Supreme Court ruled. And so what was becoming income to the federal government, helping with the deficit, suddenly has now become returning money to the people who paid those tariffs, companies. And that is actually obviously a negative for the deficit. So, in fact, tariffs are on their way from not even being a positive, but potentially being a negative and helping that $1.9 trillion deficit.
Elon Musk feels like a character from another lifetime there, but I suspect we'll see him in a lot of Democratic ads this fall. So, Steve, your final chart addresses Trump's claims about his ability to boost America's manufacturing industry. Let's take a look at what the president told small business owners this past May.
One of the strongest effects of our tax cuts and tariffs is the Trump manufacturing boom is what they're calling it, because that's what we have. We have never had anything like what's happening now. And when I talk about, again, the $18 trillion, that's coming in and building places.
So, Steve, a lot of bravado there, but where do things actually stand among manufacturing jobs right now?
Yeah, again, it's kind of incredible to hear the president describe himself as the manufacturing president, and I applaud his ambitions, but let's just talk about what the reality is. The reality is that manufacturing, obviously you had COVID and all the stuff going on, but it got as high as 12.9 million jobs back here. And then it started to decline, and it has simply continued to decline under Trump. So, in fact, rather than gaining any manufacturing jobs, we've lost 75,000 manufacturing jobs since Trump arrived. He also likes to talk about the building boom. I think on the show yesterday he talked about $19 trillion of new investment in America. That is obviously a crazy number. But in any event, when you look at something like factory building, you can see that the factory building went up sharply under Biden. A lot of this had to do with the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, incentives for clean energy. Companies were out building stuff. Then it peaked, and now it has just been going down under Trump, down to a $175 billion rate from a peak of $250 billion. Trump also likes to talk about data centers and how much they're going to help this manufacturing boom, so to speak. And in fact, you can see data center construction has gone up a bit. It's up to $43 billion, but not nearly enough to compensate for how much actual factory loss has been achieved. And of course, data centers employ not so many people. Factories employ a lot of people. So again, no manufacturing boom, no manufacturing renaissance evident in any of the numbers. And tariffs played a role in this. They raised the cost of steel and aluminum and discouraged businesses from building manufacturing facilities here.
Morning, Joe. Economic analyst Steve Ratner with a banger set of charts this morning. Steve, thank you so much. Still ahead here on Morning Joe, President Trump seems to change his tune on China just a few days after he made the remarkable accusation that that country had meddled in U.S. elections. So we'll show you his new response to questions about his upcoming meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Plus, a new study from the American Heart Association says you shouldn't stop at just one cup of coffee. Thank God. We'll tell you about